Ask most people what language Japan speaks, and you'll get one answer, said with total confidence. Japanese. One country, one people, one language. The assumption feels so obvious that almost nobody questions it. Here's what that confident answer misses. Japan has an entire indigenous language, spoken on its own soil for thousands of years, that has almost nothing in common with Japanese at all. Different grammar, different vocabulary, different origin entirely. Linguists have spent over a century trying to find its relatives anywhere on Earth and have never conclusively found any. And right now, in the year 2026, the number of people who can speak it fluently as their first language is estimated to be fewer than 10. Not 10,000, 10. This is the story of Ainu, the language of Japan's original inhabitants in the north, a language Japan spent a century actively trying to erase, and a language a small number of people are now racing to bring back from the edge of the same fate that claimed Sumerian, Etruscan, and hundreds of other languages that simply ran out of speakers. Welcome to the Airlearn Language Show. Today, we're going into the language hiding inside Japan's own borders that most Japanese people themselves know almost nothing about, where it came from, why it has no known relatives anywhere on the planet, how a deliberate government policy nearly finished it off, and what's actually happening right now to save it before it's too late. And if a story on the edge of disappearing makes you think differently about the languages you have easy access to learn, Airlearn is built to help you actually use that access. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to who was in Japan before Japan existed, long before the Japanese state as we know it took shape. The northern regions of the Japanese archipelago, what is today Hokkaido, along with parts of Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands, now controlled by Russia, were home to the Ainu people, a distinct indigenous population with their own culture, spiritual practices, and language unrelated to the Yamato Japanese who came to dominate the rest of the archipelago. The Ainu were traditionally hunter-gatherers and fishers with a rich oral tradition, distinctive art, and a spiritual worldview centered on the belief that spirits, called kamoi, inhabited animals, plants, tools, and natural phenomena. Their language, Ainu, was passed down entirely through speech for most of its history. There was no native Ainu writing system for the vast majority of its existence, which means everything we know about its earlier stages comes either from oral tradition preserved by later generations or from documentation created from outsiders. For centuries, contact between the Ainu and the Japanese state to the south was limited and often adversarial, particularly as Japanese settlement gradually expanded northward. But the real turning point, the one that set the language on its path toward near extinction, came in the late 1800s. Most languages belong to a family. English belongs to the Germanic branch of Indo-European, related to German and Dutch, and more distantly to French and Hindi. Japanese itself, while its exact family classification has been debated by linguists, is generally treated as either an isolate or as belonging to a small family with the ryukyuan languages spoken in Okinawa, but it shows clear historical contact with Chinese, Korean, and other neighboring languages over centuries. Ainu has none of that. Its grammar, its core vocabulary, its sound system, none of it lines up in any convincing, systematic way with Japanese, Korean, the Ainu languages near neighbors, or any other documented language family on Earth. Linguists have proposed connections over the decades, even occasionally to more distinct hypothetical macro families. But none of these proposals has achieved anything close to the scholarly consensus. As far as mainstream historical linguists can currently demonstrate, Ainu is a language isolate, a language with no proven surviving relatives anywhere in the world. This puts Ainu in the same rare category as Basque in Europe or Korean itself, a language that stands alone. Deeper history essentially locked away because the languages it might have once been related to either never existed as we needed them to, or vanished so long ago that no trace of the connection survived. Structurally, Ainu is also genuinely distinctive. It's a polysynthetic language, meaning it can pack an enormous amount of grammatical information into a single word through combinations of prefixes and suffixes. A single Ainu verb can incorporate what would be an entire sentence's worth of meaning in English. This alone makes it a language of genuine interest to linguists, independent of its political history. It's a structurally unique system that exists nowhere else. And if it disappears, an entire way of encoding meaning through language disappears with it. In 1869, the new Meiji government formally annexed the Northern Territory, the Ainu called home, and renamed it Hokkaido, incorporating it directly into the Japanese state. What followed was not a passive neglect. It was active policy. The Meiji's government approach to the Ainu closely mirrored assimilation policies happening in other parts of the world during the same era. Ainu land was reclassified and redistributed to Japanese settlers. Traditional Ainu subsistence practices, including specific hunting and fishing methods central to their culture, were restricted or banned outright. And critically, the Japanese language was imposed as the language of education, administration, and public life, while speaking Ainu was actively discouraged, and in various periods and contexts, punished. The 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act, despite its protective-sounding name, functioned as an assimilation law. It pushed Ainu communities towards Japanese-style agriculture and Japanese language education, treating Ainu identity and language as something to be phased out rather than preserved. Generations of Ainu children grew up being taught explicitly that speaking Japanese and abandoning visible markers of Ainu identity was the path to being accepted and succeeding within Japanese society. The result played out exactly the way this policy tends to: a rapid, severe drop in intergenerational transmission. Parents who had been punished or shamed for speaking Ainu as children frequently made the painful, practical decision not to teach it to their own children, believing, often correctly, given the discrimination Ainu people faced, that fluency in Japanese and invisibility as Ainu offered a safer path forward. Within just a few generations, a language that had been spoken continuously for thousands of years came remarkably close to having no new speakers being raised at all. By the mid to late 20th century, the number of fluent native Ainu speakers had collapsed to a small population of mostly elderly people, largely concentrated in specific communities in Hokkaido. Estimates from recent decades have placed the number of remaining fully fluent native speakers in the range of a handful of people. And by the 2020s, some estimates suggest the number of people who acquired Ainu as a true first language, learned at home from birth, in a fully Ainu-speaking household, many to be fewer than 10 individuals, nearly all of them elderly. This puts Ainu in the category linguistics sometimes called moribund, a language still technically spoken, but by a population so small and aged that without dramatic intervention, it faces the very real possibility of having no living native speakers within the coming years. What makes this especially stark is the contrast with how invisible the situation is to most people, including most Japanese citizens. Japan has long promoted an image of itself, both domestically and internationally, as an unusually linguistically and ethnically homogeneous nation. One people, one language, one culture. That narrative made it easier for most of the 20th century for the Ainu and their language to be essentially erased from mainstream public consciousness, even as active government policy had been a direct cause of the crisis in the first place. The story doesn't end at extinction because there is now a real active effort underway to reverse decades of suppression, though it's racing against a genuinely difficult clock. A significant turning point came in 2008 when the Japanese Diet, Japanese National Parliament, formally recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people of Japan, the first time the national government had done so, more than a century after the policies that had devastated their language and culture began. This was followed in 2019 by a new law that went further, explicitly recognizing Ainu rights, and notably, funding the establishment of the National Ainu Museum and Park, known as Apapoi, which opened in Hokkaido in 2020 as a national center for Ainu culture, language, education, and public awareness. Language revitalization efforts have taken multiple forms. Researchers and Ainu community members have worked to record the speech of the last generation of fully fluent elders, preserving vocabulary, oral literature, and traditional epic narratives, called yukar, before that knowledge is lost entirely. Language classes, both in Hokkaido and increasingly through university programs and online resources, now exist to teach Ainu in interested second language learners, a population notably that is now larger than the remaining first language speaker population, which in itself is an unusual and telling sign of a language in the revitalization stage rather than simply decline. Whether Ainu can be meaningfully revived as a living intergenerational transmitted language, rather than preserved primarily as an academic and ceremonial subject, remains a genuinely open question. But for the first time in over a century, there is now active institutional support, public funding, and a Japanese government that has formally acknowledged the harm of its own historical policy, working in the same direction as the small number of Ainu people and linguists who never stopped trying to keep the language alive. So here's what the Ainu language actually represents. It's proof that one country, one language is very often a simplified story that a nation tells about itself, one that erases whoever doesn't fit the narrative, sometimes through active, documented policy rather than accident. Japan is home to a language with no known relatives anywhere in the world, structurally unlike anything spoken nearby, carrying thousands of years of oral tradition and a distinct spiritual worldview. And most of the world, including most of Japan, has never been taught it exists. Ainu came within a generation or two of disappearing entirely, not because its speakers stopped valuing it, but because an entire state apparatus spent a century making it costly and dangerous to pass on. And now, a small number of people, some of the less fully fluent elders, alongside linguists, activists, and young Ainu descendants, learning a language their own grandparents were often too afraid to teach to them, are trying to do something genuinely difficult, rebuilding a language from what remains before the last native fluency disappears for good. Every extinct or nearly extinct language is a reminder that a language dying isn't really about words disappearing. It's about an entire way of describing the world. Kamui in every rock and river, verb structures that pack a sentence into a single word, going quiet, sometimes within living memory, sometimes because of a policy with a name and a date. If a story like this makes you think differently about the languages you have easy, unthreatened access to learn, Airlearn is a good place to actually do something with that. Links in the description. See you in the next one.